was Minister of National Defense, which is a long time ago, I got sighting reports, and there were as many sighting reports. About 80% were natural phenomena, and about 20% were unexplained, unidentified. Well, at the time, as Peter just explained, I was far too busy trying to unify the armed forces in fighting what proved to be a very, very difficult battle to be interested in flying objects. And the closest I came to contact with the UFO scene, as Grant just explained to you, was on June the 3rd, 1967, which was Canada's centennial year, our 100th anniversary. And as Minister of National Defense, I was invited to fly to St. Paul, Alberta, a little bilingual town, and to dedicate their world's first flying saucer landing pad. And I can't remember who wrote the speech, Grant, but I was reading it the other day because somebody's doing a documentary on the scene, and it sounded pretty good. I sounded a little more advanced than I actually was at the time. Well, many years would pass before I began taking a more serious interest in the subject of UFOs. Not long after the turn of the century, I began receiving mail from a young man in Ottawa by the name of Pierre Junot. And he would send me this stuff, and I tried to be honest. I said, Pierre, I haven't got time to read it. He said, it's okay, just keep it in case you ever have a rainy day. And so I did. And one time, he sent me a copy of a book that looked interesting. It was the day after Roswell. And I said, oh, well, that looks interesting. I'll take that as my summer readings, maybe next summer. In the meantime, he asked me to watch Peter Jennings' 2-hour ABC special on this subject, and I know that most ufologists think that it was a debunker. But I listened to all those ex-pilots, airline pilots, and armed forces personnel, and air traffic controllers and policemen, who all said they had seen UFOs. And I said to myself, they're not lying. Why would they go on a program like that and tell lies? So this had quite an impact on me, actually. So I looked for the book to take in my holiday and couldn't find it. Found The Life of Pi instead. Don't know how many of you have read it, but I didn't know right until the end whether it was fact or fiction. And if you haven't seen the movie, it's very good. I would recommend it. And the following year, which was 2005, I was looking for another book and couldn't find it, and there staring me in the face was The Day After Roswell. So I said, well, this will do just fine. So I took it along and sat in one of these big chairs in the lawn by the lake and started to read it. And I was about halfway through, and my nephew Philip came along and said, what are you reading? And I told him, and he said, well, I'm a skeptic. Well, I said, it's a free country, more or less, and you're entitled to be a skeptic if you want to. So he went home, and I finished the book, and I was absolutely convinced that it was authentic. And that was because I recognized the names of the generals and the airfields from my days as Minister of National Defense. And meantime, Philip phoned me and said, I called the general, and he said, told him what you were reading, and he said, every word is true and more. Where can I get a copy of the book? In the meantime, Mike Bird, who was sitting right down here, and Victor Vigiani had invited me to speak at a UFO conference they were putting on at the University of Toronto, and I had absolutely no idea of accepting because I didn't know anything about the subject. And I just hadn't got around to saying no. And as a matter of fact, I was getting married to Sandra exactly 1 week after the conference. So I had this dilemma. I had to go public because I thought of the issues involved and the people of the world should know about. So I decided that it would be really irresponsible on my part if I didn't speak out. So I phoned Sandra, and she was a little reluctant, I think. But I told her it was just a one-off. I didn't mean to lie to you, dear. I just didn't know what I was talking about. So once she said yes, I asked Philip to give the general a heads up that I was going to call him because I had met him at an air show. And I called him, and before I could even say, hello, how are you? He said, every word is true and more. And then he spent the next 20 minutes telling me about the more, insofar as he could without breaking his oath. And that included the fact that there had been face-to-face contact between U.S. officials and the extraterrestrials. So with that assurance, I phoned, I don't know whether it was you, Mike, or Victor, but one or the other, and said, I'll do it. And then I scrambled around trying to find out what to say, and finally arrived there in a total daze. But the thing that I said that was worth saying was UFOs are as real as the airplanes flying overhead. And that gave me the dubious distinction of being the first person of cabinet rank in the G8 group of countries to say that unequivocally, no reservations, because I knew it was true then, and I know that it's true now. Well, as soon as I'd gone public, my education really began. I figure it's in about kindergarten then, and maybe today I could be grade 6 or 7, something like that, moving along. Learned more in the last year than I did in the previous 89 years. Documents of all kinds started flowing into my office, some of them classified, some of them not classified. Some of them were pretty iffy, and I pretty soon learned how to differentiate between the wheat and the chaff, as the saying goes. And I got books from all over, including from many of the best ufologists in North America. And I read every one of them. And I had briefings. The first one, Dr. Stephen Greer was visiting Toronto, and he phoned, and we met for lunch on the waterfront, and he gave me a 3-hour briefing. And this went on and on. Paula Harris came to interview me and became a friend and mentor. And since then, I've attended several UFO conferences, spoken at several of them, and listened to literally scores of presenters, each one with her or his specialty. Also, I interviewed several abductees, including Travis Walton and Jim Sparks, while attending a crash retrieval conference in Las Vegas in, I think it was 2007. And I spent a lot of time with each of them. And I asked them a lot of tough questions. And by the time I finished in each case, I said, these men are both telling the truth. And so I felt free to quote them and to refer to them. Another highlight while I was there in Las Vegas was a private briefing that Dr. Bob Wood and I had on Area 28, which is one of the lesser known ones compared to Areas 51, S4, Indian Springs, and Dulce. So my knowledge and understanding has continued to grow to the point where I felt comfortable to put one chapter saying we are not alone in the cosmos. It's just a primer. It's not where you go to learn about UFOs. As I said, it's primarily about what's going on in the world and who's doing it to us and what we have to do to save the situation if we can. So incidentally, I'm not in the business of selling books. I'm in the business of selling ideas. And that's the only reason that I even mention books, is because there are things there that I thought and still think a lot of people should know who don't know. The best line in the book, in my opinion, is I didn't know how much I didn't know because I didn't know how much there was to know. And it's when Grant was speaking, a line I used to say to myself came back. Grant, was I used to say that anything within the realm of human imagination is possible. As I understood, that's what you said this morning. And it just confirmed a belief that I've had for decades. Well, it seems that the ETs have been around for a long time. A document labeled as an assessment is a good place to start. The story was related by Command Sergeant Major Robert O. Dean. On February the 1st, 1961, about 50 UFOs flying in formation emerged from Russia and flew across NATO Europe. Well, you can imagine that the SHAPE headquarters was pretty excited about that, SHAPE being the supreme headquarters of the Allied powers in Europe. And fortunately, just before they pressed the panic button, the flotilla turned around and headed north towards the pole. But the incident resulted in an investigation and a report being written from 1961 to 1964, where the conclusions were earth-shaking. The authors determined with absolute certainty that we had been visited by at least 4 species for thousands of years. Well, that is my own judgment. And it was something in the book I said that I thought the Star of Bethlehem had been one of God's spaceships, because there's absolutely no other way that you can explain its path and how it wound up in Bethlehem over one particular house. Although there have been periodic sightings over the years, the increased interest in planet Earth appears to coincide with World War II and subsequent events. In World War II, the Foo fighters shadowed planes likely on both sides of the conflict. The first crash apparently occurred in 1941 in the ocean west of San Diego. It was retrieved by the U.S. Navy. There were dead Zeta reticulans, alias the Greys, aboard. And they were taken to the Foreign Technology section at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. After dismantling the craft, the parts were sent to S4 in Indian Springs in Nevada. The cause of the crash was alleged to be a recently invented pulse radar being tested on the nearby Tinian Island, located 3 miles southwest of Saipan. The U.S. Navy has held a leadership position in UFO matters ever since. And how many of you are familiar with the Shag Harbor event? About half of you. Well, Shag Harbor is in Nova Scotia, Canada, and there was a UFO went into the ocean there. And of course, people thought that it was a crash, so they went to look for the wreckage. It didn't seem to be visible, but it wasn't long before U.S. Navy deep-sea divers arrived on the scene. and combed the bottom of the ocean. And they never did find it because, as we know now, they're quite capable, a lot of them, flying into the water, flying under the water, and then flying out of the water. And that is almost certainly exactly what it did. But it's a matter of interest that the Navy has been so involved for so long, and yet not many Navy veterans have joined the disclosure movement. I don't know if there's any particular reason for that. The next crash was in 1945, that's recorded anyway, in New Mexico, and that was uncovered by Paula Harris. And I had the pleasure of interviewing Remy Baca, one of the men, boys turned man, who was involved and saw the crash. And I don't know if he was the one that went inside Paula or not, but was the other one that went inside. But the crash that is best known around the world occurred not far from Roswell, New Mexico, in July '47. As those of you who are in the loop know, there were actually two crashes, and the Army Air Corps issued a press release at first saying the flying saucer had crashed, and then before the Eastern papers could go to press, issued another release saying no, it had been a balloon. And that was the beginning of half a century of misinformation and disinformation. And what I found so interesting was that the balloon was the same excuse that they had given in 1945 when they went to ask permission to pick up the craft. It showed a singular lack of imagination, I thought. One of the most interesting witnesses in Washington last week was Colonel French. And Colonel only spoke for a few minutes, but he said more in a few minutes than most of us can say in an hour. And what he said was, it was his job when there was a UFO sighting to issue a press release saying that it was swamp gas. Well, we knew that these excuses were made up, but to have him say that that was his job and say it publicly and say it not apologetically because he was paid to do it, it was part of his job, but the time has come when he thought we should know, the public should know, that this was all just fiction to try and make the cover-up work. Well, there was this beginning of an era of multiple sightings, thousands of them all over the world, the US, Canada, Europe, Russia, South America, everywhere. And interestingly enough, this new interest appears to coincide with the detonation of the first atomic bomb at White Sands, New Mexico. I think they thought that children are playing with matches, and that they had better keep an eye on us before we blow ourselves up and wreck our planet forever, or at least for thousands of years, to make it uninhabitable. And as far as I can determine, they have taken inventory of every atomic site, storage facility, etc., worldwide. And as Peter told us yesterday, the Rendlesham Forest case, they were there for a very definite reason. And the same was true of the missile sites that Bob Salas told us about last week that were put out of action. What we earthlings don't seem to appreciate, and you will after having been here this weekend, is that all worlds in the galaxy are interconnected. One Hiroshima bomb can affect every different culture. No wonder our visitors are so worried about us. So one of the questions often asked is about the interaction between ETs and humans. It has been almost continuous since 1947. There was, as you know, allegedly one survivor who was named EB number 1, and later much cooperation between ETs and the U.S. military by at least 2 species and maybe more. The Greys at S4 and Area 51, exchanging technology, genetics, experiments, other things, some of them that we might wonder about if we knew about. Were agreements made? Yes. What were the contents? We don't know. I think we'd like to know. I've often wondered if the agreements included allowing abductions and cattle mutilations. I don't know, but it would be good to know. Another fascinating story broken by Paula Harris was about the tall whites at Indian Springs. Charles James Hall has written a number of books called Millennial Hospitality, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and number 2 I think is the best of the 4. But again, it was arranged that I could speak to him, and so I talked to him, or more accurately listened to him for 3 hours, explaining what he had largely put in his book, of working with the tall whites in the Nevada desert and being totally scared out of his skin the first time he saw them sort of drifting across the sagebrush, and then eventually coming face to face, getting to know them, getting to understand them, getting to trust them, and vice versa, and in his case became quite fast friends with at least 1 or 2 of them. The most fascinating story that I'm going to tell, and it takes a while, but for years I've heard rumors about an exchange between Earthlings, more specifically Americans, with ETs. And there's now finally some information on that exchange. And the story I'm going to tell you I can't prove. And well, somebody said if you can't prove it, don't tell it. But in this business, if you had to prove everything you say, you wouldn't say anything. So I've decided to say it for 3 reasons. First of all, it's an interesting story. Secondly, it's plausible, technically. It could have happened. Thirdly, my most reliable source told me that it was true. So most of you, I'm sure, saw the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, written and directed by Steven Spielberg, and released in 1977. An alien spaceship lands in a high mesa called the Devil's Tower in a remote corner of Wyoming by prearrangement with the government. An ambassadorial exchange takes place, a single alien disembarks and is escorted away, presumably to a secret site somewhere. 12 American astronauts in orange jumpsuits and industrial-strength sunglasses with duffel bags slung over their shoulders, 10 men, 2 women, march into the spacecraft to be whisked away to the alien home planet. In the previous scene, they had been given a blessing by a clergyman who referred to them as pilgrims. Was this just some inventive touch conceived by Spielberg, or did he base it on something real? Since it is now known that a prearranged alien landing did take place at or near Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico in April '64, it is not unreasonable to conclude that Spielberg may have had an inside track on classified information, that the ambassadorial exchange with an alien race may also have been a real event. In my opinion, another one of a long series of controlled leaks in order to put us a little more into the picture. So it has been revealed by former military insiders that the exchange was indeed real and took place almost exactly as depicted in the movie. Under the auspices of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the program referred to as Operation Crystal Night, also known as Serpol Project, has been claimed that 12 astronauts left Earth in July 1965 and were taken to the planet Serpol in the binary star system Zeta Reticuli aboard an alien ship as part of an exchange program. The bulk of this information about the program was dribbled out to the world via 21 emails from an individual referred to only as Anonymous, to a closed circle of high-level UFO insiders beginning on November 2nd, 2005. Anonymous says that he was formerly a senior officer of the DIA and was the official spokesman for a group of 6 DIA personnel. 3 retired at the time of the revelation. And one of the UFO insiders, Bill Ryan from England, volunteered for the job, and so began www.serpol.org, which has now developed into the official source for all Serpol-related information, including updates from Ryan, a link to the public forum, and supporting emails from other insiders who had knowledge of the project. The story told by Anonymous in the 21 emails is amazing. If it is true, then the entire history of the government pretense of ignorance about UFOs and extraterrestrials is completely negated. As expected, it begins with Roswell. But that story is so well known that I'm not going to repeat it here. Instead, I will pick up the story with the one survivor, probably from the Datil site at Roswell, who was found hiding behind a rock. He was taken to Los Alamos and designated biological entity number 1. And although he spoke in tonal variations, just as in Close Encounters, the scientists at Los Alamos found a way to communicate with him, and he informed them that he was from a planet in the Zeta Reticuli system, about 40 light years from Earth. He also provided them with a complete explanation of all the devices found in the crashed spacecraft, one of which was a piece of equipment for communicating with his home planet. However, the Los Alamos scientists could not get it to work until they discovered how to hook it up to the energy source on the crashed disk. That was the early summer of 1952. However, EB-1 died later that summer after sending 6 unanswered messages to his planet. After his death, the Los Alamos scientists figured out how to use the device, and they received the first reply from their efforts to contact Serpol around December 1952. Eventually, they were able to converse in rough English. Finally, in 1962, it was arranged that the Ebens would meet the craft at Holloman Air Force Base near Alamogordo. By this time, President Kennedy was in office. Then, according to Anonymous, several months into the planning process, President Kennedy decided to approve a plan to exchange a special military team. The USAF was tasked as the lead agency. The USAF officials picked special civilian scientists to assist in planning and crew selection. It was arranged that we would send 12 astronauts to Serpol, and they would leave 1 Eben here in the custody of the U.S. government. Listen to the selection and training of these 12 ambassadors. After months of discussion, it was ultimately decided that they should be career military, single, with no children, and preferably orphans themselves, and have multiple skills. Originally, about 56,000 files were screened, of which 158 were picked by the selection committee. The final 12, 10 men and 2 women, plus 4 alternatives, were chosen based on complex psychological, medical, and other tests. All the team were sheep-dipped. That is, all identification records were purged, including Social Security, Internal Revenue Service, medical, military, and so on. And they were all listed as missing and discharged in their military records, so that there was no connection with their former employment. They went through very difficult training for 6 months, mostly at Camp Pearlie in Virginia. This is the not-so-secret CIA training facility referred to as the Farm on the lower York River near Williamsburg. They were also given astronaut training at Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida. And Anonymous says each team member had to endure extreme psychological and physical training. In one training test, and this is the one that sends shivers up and down my back, each team member was locked inside a 5x7 box, which was buried 7 feet underground for 5 days with just food and water, no contact with anyone else, and in total darkness. Ooh, I'm claustrophobic. And just the mere thought of a test of that kind really literally sends shivers up and down my back. 4 of the team members who were pilots were taught to fly an even craft, using for training the spaceship that was recovered at Datil, in case it was necessary to escape from Serpol. In addition to the 4 pilots, the team consisted of 2 linguists, 1 biologist, 2 scientists, 2 doctors, and 1 security man. They were all given suicide pills, and the team was assigned 4 Colt .45 revolvers and 8 M2 carbine rifles. The 1964 rendezvous occurred almost exactly as planned. The alien visitors were greeted by 16 senior U.S. government officials. The 12 astronauts were ready to board at that meeting and waited for a bus, but the aliens decided that the exchange should have to wait until '65. Then in 1965, an alien craft returned, this time to a prearranged location on the Nevada test site, a huge Department of Energy reservation about 95 miles north of Las Vegas. Very much like the scene in Close Encounters, this was a simple, unceremonious working meeting. The 12 courageous astronauts boarded the Eben craft, along with 45 tons of supplies for an intended stay of 10 years. 4 of them would never see Mother Earth again. 2 would die, and 2 would choose to remain on Serpol. The others would not return until 13 years later. The population of Serpol is about 650,000, and Anonymous says that the Eben civilization is about 10,000 years old, originating on another planet that they were forced to leave 5,000 years ago because of volcanic destruction. Timekeeping was a problem for the astronauts since the batteries controlling the timepieces brought by the team eventually ran out. This meant that they could not keep track of the calendar. So they eventually relied on Serpo time, which was governed by the movement of its suns. So they lost track of Earth time and ended up staying 13 years instead of 10. It was determined by Earth scientists that Kepler's law of planetary motion did not apply to Serpo. Carl Sagan was consulted on this and wrote about 60 pages of opinion. But ultimately, he had to acknowledge that earthly laws of physics do not necessarily apply out of this solar system. The 8 astronauts returned in 1978 and were debriefed for a solid year. And these investigations resulted in a 3,000-page book. Anonymous claims to have a copy of this book. Keeps it in one of his back pockets. And the survivors were released into civilian life, and the last passed away in 2002. They had absorbed large doses of radiation while on Serpo, and it is believed that this shortened their lives. In retrospect, it seems a shame that President Kennedy didn't live to see his initiative become a reality. He was assassinated only 5 months before the first landing. Because Kennedy was strongly opposed to government secrecy, it seems very likely that he would have used the occasion to reveal the extraterrestrial connection, perhaps with worldwide TV coverage. And that was probably his plan from the beginning. Perhaps some powerful insiders didn't want that to happen. In any case, we can thank Steven Spielberg for the fact that we could at least see a staged version of that momentous event. We all got to see it after all. Our story confirms in spades the extent and depth of the cover-up, going back half a century to the 1960s. Is it justified? Well, I would say no, although I can understand why it would have been in the early years. World War II had just finished. The American forces had played a very important part in winning the World War II. And for the American military to all of a sudden find that someone else had technology that was light years ahead of theirs would have been a terrible shock. And I can understand that. But I can't understand is why it continued after the Cold War ended. Until then, probably they were afraid that Russia might be doing the same kind of thing. But with the end of the Cold War, there was really, in my opinion, no excuse. And I think they could release about 95 to 98% of all the information they have. And naturally it would come out in small bits because congressional inquiry, for example, would have to start somewhere. It would start at the beginning, and day by day people would get used to it and would roll with the punches. There's only, I think, 2 or 3 things that I know that I think should not be released to the public, at least not for a while, because I think it would be a little hard to absorb. But the rest, yes. And worse than the cover-up was the way U.S. servicemen were treated if they talked about what they saw. And to have servicemen and their families intimidated the way we have heard, I think is, well, very, very bad, to use an understatement. I just cannot understand why they would go to such extreme lengths as to intimidate the servicemen and their families. And as Captain Robert Salas said last week, summed up the situation in one sentence: it's power and greed. It's not national security. And we have to have disclosure because the stakes are too high to fail. Global warming is #1 problem facing the world today. And in my book, I said we had a decade. It was written a couple of years ago that we had until the end of the decade to do something about it. 2 years have gone by. We've got about 7 or 8 years left. And yet we know that the technology exists. But unfortunately, the same people who are making us poor and are controlling what is happening in the world and in the United States own the oil companies, and they don't want competition in that field, and they have big stakes in the pharmaceutical companies and the healing industry, and they don't want us to have the kind of healing that we're told about yesterday, which is considered a miracle because they're way ahead of us in medicine, in agriculture, as well as technology, and we should be reaping the benefits of this because they came, I think, to help us. That's what an alien told Colonel Corso. We're here to help you if you'll let us. So I'd like to close by reading the same advice that I closed on my presentation to disclosure hearing last week. And this is from the ETs themselves. We're saying this, and it's a quote from Jim Sparks. And Jim was kind enough to let me put it in my book, and I appreciate it very much, and I put it in because it's so important. What do they want us to know? I won't read the whole thing, but I'll read what I think are the most important parts. This is the extraterrestrials. Yes, it's true. No, there are some things you need to understand. Yes, it's true that we have been in contact with your government and heads of power. It is also true that agreements have been made and kept secret from your people. It is also true that in the past, some of your people have lost their lives or have been badly hurt to protect the secret. Our hands had no part in this. We contacted your leaders because your planet is in grave trouble. Your leaders said the vast majority of your population wasn't ready for anything like us yet. So we made time agreements with your leaders as to when your people would be made aware of our presence. This part of the agreement has not at all been kept. It was also agreed that in the meantime, steps would be taken to correct the environmental condition of your planet with our advice and technology. We say advice because we respect the fact that this is your planet, not ours. They also broke this agreement. Now this is Jim Sparks speaking. I felt an awful wave of emotion from them. The feeling of abandonment. To feel any emotion from them at all was amazing, but this was quite overwhelming. You aren't going to give up on us, are you? I asked. There was a long, silent pause, and I received the transmitted feeling of tremendous loss. Well, are you? I asked. No. I felt an immediate sense of relief straight from my own emotion. Then the extraterrestrials carried on. Your air, your water are contaminated. Your forests, jungles, trees, and planet life are dying. There are several breaks in your food chain. You have an overwhelming amount of nuclear and biological weapons, which include nuclear and biological contamination. Your planet is overpopulated. Warning, it is almost the point of being too late, unless your people act. There are better ways of deriving energy and food needs without causing your planet any damage. Those in power are aware of this and have the capability of putting these methods into worldwide use. I let this digest for a moment. I definitely had the feeling that these creatures were speaking as one. Then I asked, why aren't we doing that now? Silence. I was willing to wait. I'd come a long way to be treated like this by them, to have this kind of a meeting. Apparently, I had earned their respect and trust. The best part was that I was getting it direct, truthful answers to my questions. I decided that I would milk this rare situation to its fullest, asking as many questions as I could get away with, even personal questions. I repeated my question and they answered. This is the extraterrestrials. Those in power view it as a military and security threat. That upset me. You mean to tell me that the people in power have the ability to save and better the planet, and they aren't doing it? Amnesty. What do you mean? Complete amnesty to those in power. Governments and leaders who have been suppressing the truth. They can't be held liable for their past wrong deeds. It is the only way these leaders can come forward with the truth. It is necessary that you do this in order to work together and survive. Jim goes on to confirm what has been said here this afternoon, or this morning, that because the agreement has been broken, they are working through individuals like us, like every person here in this room, to try and get the message out, in the hope that we will take their warning seriously, and that somehow we will be able to transmit the urgency to our leaders and to get them to act before it's too late.